Welcome to another episode of Globetrotting 5. In this episode, we are going to discuss the US capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. As you may know, over the weekend, the US conducted a daring raid on Venezuela that led to the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife. The two of them were whisked away by US Special Forces to the United States. There, Maduro is supposedly facing charges related to drug trafficking into the United States. Actually, the US has been building up pressure against Venezuela for months. In fact, it had been amassing a great number of military assets in the Caribbean, specifically to push Maduro or pressure Maduro. However, no one saw this raid coming. Everyone thought that Washington's pressure tactics would either see Maduro cave to Washington's demands or Maduro would simply leave Venezuela. However, the raid, which happened in a matter of few hours, saw US special forces overwhelm or at least deceive the Venezuelan armed forces, go in and extract Maduro and his wife as they were sleeping in their beds in the presidential compound. Following the capture of Maduro, Trump then held a press conference in which he said that the US would now run Venezuela. Well, this is a little bit confusing because even though Maduro has been captured and taken out of the country, the remnants of his regime, his government, they remain very much intact. In fact, Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, has been named interim president by the Venezuelan Supreme Court. And she convened a meeting of the national security team of Venezuela and vowed to defend Venezuela against any further aggression by the United States. So the Maduro regime in Venezuela remains and is operating, even though Maduro himself is not there. So Maduro's government hasn't been dismantled. There hasn't been a coup against the Maduro government. It remains in place, yet the United States is saying that now we are in charge and we are going to run things in Venezuela. How it plans to do that? Not clear. What is the future for Venezuela? Not clear. So, why did Trump take this extraordinary step? Well, there are many theories that are floating around, but let's step back and look at the context in which this is happening. As I just mentioned, that the US had been ramping up pressure on Maduro and the Venezuelan government for some time. It's very clear that Trump wanted Maduro gone. The official reason that the United States gave is that Maduro was presiding over a narco state, and that this narco state was funneling narcotics into the United States. However, that is debatable because many believe that Venezuela itself was not the source of narcotics flowing into the United States, but was actually one of the countries through which the narcotics trade was transiting. So that remains a matter of dispute and debate. However, Trump wanted Maduro gone because he saw Maduro as someone that was antithetical to US interests in the Western Hemisphere. But then the big question is, why now? Well, again, let's look at what Venezuela under Maduro was doing. Venezuela under Maduro had built solid relationships with China. In fact, it was one of the South American countries with the highest amount of Chinese debt. It had also built up significant security relations with Russia and to some extent with Iran. So you had in Venezuela a country in US's backyard that had built solid client state relationships with China and Russia and Iran, countries that are strategically trying to undermine the US. Now, remember, this raid comes just after the US published its new national security document. And what does that new national security document say? That new US national security document says that the US is going to treat the Western Hemisphere, which is essentially, the western half of the world, around the Americas, North America and South America. It is going to treat the Western Hemisphere as its own strategic backyard. In other words, it is going to reclaim this space and make this completely a US friendly zone. That is what it implies. So, this was clearly mentioned in the US national security document, but the reality is that China over the last decade or so had made significant inroads in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in South America. So, from a strategic point of view, US strategic point of view, I think the US is trying to correct this situation, this strategic situation, and push back against growing Chinese footprint, Chinese and Russian footprint in South America, in its backyard. So it is taking back its backyard. So this, as many experts have rightly said, is Monroe Doctrine 2.0. So Monroe Doctrine was essentially that the United States will treat the Western Hemisphere as its own backyard. It will not overextend itself into other parts of the world. It will confine itself to the Americas, to the Western Hemisphere. So that was the crux of the Monroe Doctrine. And so what we are seeing is a replay of the Monroe Doctrine under a new America First rubric. And the Trump administration's actions against Venezuela needs to be seen in that context. So, does this make what the US did in Venezuela normal? No, absolutely not. What the US has done cannot be justified in international law. You can't just swoop in to another country and essentially kidnap the leadership, and whisk the leader away to your country. That cannot be justified. There is no international law that supports it. So, of course, this is not okay by any reading of international law. So this is extraordinary. However, who is saying that the US is playing by the book? The US is not playing by the book, and certainly Trump is not going to play by the book. And Trump, I don't think, cares about international law. He is simply doing what he thinks is necessary to project power under his America First rubric, and that in turn is closely tied to him maintaining his own political power in the US. As you know that Trump's ratings have been going down. He is losing support. In fact, he's losing support even among his MAGA base. There are midterm elections coming up and later this year, and most projections say that the Republicans are heading for a drubbing. So I think he needed to do something to show that he's very much a strong leader, and he is a leader that gets things done. Of course, this is in total contradiction to what he had said earlier, or what he had positioned himself as earlier, because earlier he had positioned himself as a president of peace. However, I think that he has realized that this president of peace business is not working. It's not helping him electorally or politically in the US. So he has made the shift from president of peace to a president of power. A president who exudes power, or a president who is in control, and he is willing to do anything to put America first. So this is a subtle political shift that Trump has undertaken, and he has made Venezuela an example. The second thing that experts have pointed out is that this raid to remove Maduro is actually about oil. That Trump actually wants access to Venezuela's oil because Venezuela has the largest proven reserves of oil in the world. Uh, that could be true because Venezuela is really energy rich. However, how does US actually get control of that oil? Because as I mentioned, that Maduro might be gone, but his regime, his system, that he presided over, that system, the Venezuelan army, they're still there. They're still there. So how does US plan to take Venezuela's oil, take control of Venezuela's oil? Uh, I don't see that happening, without any resistance from the Venezuelans. Uh, so the Venezuelan army and the Venezuelan government apparatus is not just going to hand over Venezuela's oil to the United States. So it remains to be seen that how the U.S. Plans to do that. Uh, the third thing that people have been talking about is democracy in Venezuela. But I don't think, again, Trump is particularly bothered about democracy in Venezuela. He has already dismissed the Venezuelan opposition. Corina Machado, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for 2025, Trump simply said that she doesn't have the support and respect within Venezuela to be part of the transition process in Caracas. So Trump, I don't think, is bothered about democracy. So to posit this as America's intervention for democracy is completely wrong. I mean, this is just power politics, plain and simple. Trump doesn't care about democracy, whether in Venezuela or in Ukraine. Speaking of Ukraine, so all of a sudden you have these people crawling out of the woodworks saying that, see, look, you were criticizing Russia for the war in Ukraine, but look what the Americans are doing in Venezuela. I mean, come on. Uh, you know, what is the point here? As I said, Trump just doesn't care about democracy. He's not interested in fostering democracy or defending democracy. That's not Trump. Uh, if what he has done in Venezuela is not legal in international law. So it's very clear that this is not about democracy. This is not about right and wrong. I mean, if you go by international law, what the Americans have done is wrong. There are no two ways about it. But this is power politics, and so to say that, oh, the Russians did this in Ukraine. I mean, they invaded Ukraine, and you criticize Russia, but look, the Americans are doing the same thing. No, that they I mean, I think you're being very, very naive here. Because if you expect that Trump is going to hold a candle for democracy, I mean, that's again, as I said, it's being very naive. This is not about democracy at all. He doesn't care about democracy, neither in Ukraine, nor in Taiwan, nor in Venezuela. That's not the point here. Because if Trump did care about democracy, he would defend Taiwan. He would defend Ukraine, certainly, much more strongly. I mean, in Ukraine, he wouldn't be hobnobbing with Putin and trying to sort of pacify Putin. No. I mean, he wouldn't be doing that if he was serious about defending a democracy like Ukraine. So that conversation is just red herring, and it's just propaganda. Chinese and Russian propaganda. So that should be ignored. But what should be taken note of is the fact that with this raid in Venezuela, the US is sending out a clear message to Russia and China. And that message is that if you're going to game the international system, if you're going to try and rewrite the international system by manipulating the international system or taking advantage of the international system or leveraging things into the international system, then the US still retains an enormous amount of capacity to play that game and cost China and Russia. In other words, if the longer Russia is bogged down in Ukraine, and the longer China is supporting Russia in that endeavor, the longer China is sort of threatening Taiwan, it will be stuck in those theaters, and the US can easily take advantage of the situation and encroach or take back the strategic space that China had created for itself in other parts of the world. So if Russia continues this war in Ukraine, it will lose allies like Maduro, like it also lost in Assad in Syria. So because it just simply can't devote resources to its allies in other parts of the world. So Maduro was actually desperately trying to reach out to the Russians and the Chinese for help, but that help never came because the Russians are stuck in Ukraine, and the Chinese, they're helping the Russians in Ukraine, and they also don't want to get sucked into a tricky situation in Venezuela. I mean, they have issues in their backyard, in the Pacific, and they are obsessed with Taiwan. So even the Chinese were like, we are not getting involved directly here. When Maduro asked for help. So this is the thing. So the US is sending a very clear message that to China and Russia that if you want to play this game, if you want to use muscle power, leverage your international system, and for your own benefit, and sort of bend the rules, the US can also do that as well. And that's and it's very clear that US retains an enormous capacity, an enormous military capacity to play that game, to play that power politics. That said, it remains to be seen what happens in Venezuela next. It's a very uncertain situation. We also have to watch out for US actions because Secretary of State Marco Rubio has hinted that after Venezuela, Cuba could be next on US's hit list. And he has said that the Cuban government is in a whole lot of trouble. So maybe this is not going to stop with Venezuela. This is really Monroe Doctrine 2.0, that the US is going to take back its sneer abroad and clearly send a message to China and Russia that don't mess about here. Let's wait and watch. With that, I would like to end this episode of Globetrotter 5. See you in the next one.